Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 31 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Karl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined once again today, after his sabbatical, by my colleague, lead cloud engineer, John Goodall. How have you enjoyed the last 2 years off work, John?
2 years. Oh, after this first day back from 2 weeks off, I feel like I need 2 years off.
2 weeks? 2 weeks? It was only 2 weeks.
It was.
Oh.
Back when I worked in a bank, we used to have to take some of our holiday as a 2-week block every year to combat fraud. So, it's been the first time I've had 2 weeks off as a block since I worked in finance, and I might make a habit of it. It's quite good.
Well, yes, it's always good to recharge the batteries. Did you get up to anything in particular during your time off?
Yeah, some and some. So I went to Arundel Castle, which is nice. For those of us that know roughly where we are in the world, that's kind of an hour from me, which is nice. It was all right. They had one of their history days on, so the kids had toy swords, and I got attacked with toy swords and shields and things by like 30 children, which was a thing.
So you're indoctrinating your children in violence.
In medieval combat. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and we've missed you, and I'm sure the listeners to the podcast have missed you as well, because we've been off the air for a couple of weeks, but we are back. We're back at full strength. We are joined today by a very special guest, Luis Valdivia, who is a fellow AWS Community Builder from Peru. And I think I mentioned to you in the preamble, Luis, I think you're our first Peruvian guest. So tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for a living, what you do in the community, etc.
Thank you for the invitation. I work primarily as a CTO of a software company called Plus One, or here in Peru is called Más Uno. We mainly focus on develop web apps, mobile apps, and all with AWS infrastructure. As a community builder, I mainly specialize in AWS media services like Media Live, Media Connect, and others, to deliver OTT applications and some other things with video.
Cool. Well, I don't think we've got articles about any of those things to talk about today, but hopefully you'll have some useful insights on the articles that we have chosen for this week's episode.
Well, we do process the recording through Media Convert. That's what we use for the recording processing.
We can talk about that as well if you like, but that wasn't on the agenda. So
no problem, because that is the main thing that we do. In Plus One, we have like two areas. That's the software factory and the OTT application we have.
Nice. And what about, so you're a year one community builder, I think you mentioned. Yes, what other things do you do for the community?
This is my first year as a community builder. This year was my second attempt. Last year, I tried my luck, but I didn't get accepted. This year, I get it because I did more works about Media Life. I shared it in the community. I attend some AWS community days here in Peru, and others by internet. So that was my year.
Nice. Well, I also know what it feels like to be rejected from the AWS Community Builder program. I did get in the first time round, and then I applied for my second year renewal and was rejected. But they said, please try again. So I upped my content game and I tried again, and I got back in, and now I'm in for my second year. So technically it's my third year, because I've been in year one twice, and now I'm partway through my second year. So I wish you the best of luck in also getting into the second year and getting the fantastic new backpack that they're issuing as swag. Yes. I knew John would have it to hand. Yeah, I think mine is also under here. So there we go. We've all got the backpacks. So yeah. So good luck in getting your backpack.
What we don't all have, but I do, the mug of endless energy, which is, it's not been on the pod for a while, but it is truly enormous. So
either that or you have a very small head.
Not
anyway,
sure how to take that.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about swag or the size of John's head. As regular listeners to the podcast will know, I think the contents of the me nearly went everywhere then. As regular listeners to the podcast will know, once a week I curate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter. And then John and I pick a subset of those articles that we'd like to talk with our guest about. So we have a set of articles for this week. And the first one is an article from the AWS News blog about how you can add macOS to your continuous integration pipelines with AWS CodeBuild. So, John, we are all standardized on Macs at Logicata. Why is this a good thing? Not that we're standardized on Macs. Why is being able to add macOS to your CI/CD pipelines a good thing?
So it says this in the... Hang on, what line does it? Basically the first line of the second paragraph. If you want to build and distribute applications for iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, tvOS, and macOS, you need to use a Mac. You have to use Xcode to do the build, and you can only run that on a Mac. So that's why this is a thing. Up until now, how did you do that? Well, you either did it on hardware, physical kit, and I have the misfortune of having done that previously. It's what I feel quite sort of strongly about these sorts of things, because that's awful. You have to put a Mac Mini somewhere or whatever, and probably once a month you have to go and fight with Xcode, get it to update, do all the package updates, do loads of brew updates, and it's just horrid. So there's that. What did you do other than that? Well, the other option was you could have a macOS EC2, and I remember getting really very excited about those when they first came out, because they were... I've been around for a couple of years now, and I remember being really very excited about those. But the problem with those, and this suffers with the same issue, but I'll get to it in a minute, is you have to configure the machine, you have to build the AMI, you have to install a whole bunch of tools. And again, the article says this. You can tell I've read them more than normal because I'm referencing the article. The article says this as well, is the bare minimum to do a build on a Mac is you need Xcode. But it's quite common to also install Ruby, and Ruby on Mac is horrid because it uses Ruby natively in the OS. So you have to do things like Ruby version managers, and that's just yeah. And it's also pretty common to install Fastlane. The Fastlane is quite a nice tool, and it's just a nice kind of wrapper around build processes. It's not uncommon for people to build apps in languages that have multiple support. So Flutter is a good example, because you can compile Flutter down to web or Android or iOS or iPadOS or lots of different things. So you're only kind of building the one app the once. So that's quite nice. And Fastlane is quite a nice wrapper for that. So there was a lot of things to install and configure, and generally it was a bit awkward to do that. And then you had to save the AMI, and you had to work out how you could use that in your pipelines, and so on and so on. And again, historically, you'd use something like GitLab or whatever, or bring your own runner. But that was, again, not great. This is a bit better because it comes with a lot of those things pre-installed. So in the same way that CodeBuild Linux has key stuff that you'd already need pre-installed, so, you know, curl and wget and all those kinds of things. This has Xcode pre-installed, it has Ruby and Fastlane pre-installed, and a couple of other bits and pieces as well, which is really kind of handy, and it saves a lot of effort. Where does this fall down, though? And that's kind of the key thing, because, and I've made this a red line for any future employment, just in case anybody does decide that they want to offer me lots more money than Karl's paying. If you do Mac, Apple, iOS application builds, I will never work there, because it is horrible. It is a full red line for me. Where does this fall down? Because this falls down generally. Problem for first, macOS builds are still horrible. You can optimize the hell out of your environment. You're still going to have to wait minutes, hours, days sometimes for the build to kind of process properly in test flight. And that's horrid. Problem number two, and this again I blame Apple for, it's not AWS's fault, they probably could have pushed them harder, but it's a license condition. So macOS EC2s have this problem, macOS on CodeBuild has this problem. You have to effectively permanently provision the hardware in order to use it. So most EC2s you get per second billing these days. I think Red Hat was the last holdout, and that's gone to per second now as well. macOS you have to bill for a minimum of 24 hours. Okay, that's brilliant. So in order to do that, you have to do provisioned instances and have them on 24. It's ugly. And basically, when I did the math a few years ago, when we were looking at this at a previous employer that did this, the maths worked out that you'd buy a reasonable mid-spec Mac Mini every 7 months if you kept it running 24/7, 365. So it's like, okay, not actually massively helpful. CodeBuild has the same problem. You have to do it through provisioned concurrency through CodeBuild rather than pay as you use, which is again annoying. Minimum 24 hour. You pay for it just to exist. Yada 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 yada. So that's horrendous. It's nice that they're bringing this functionality kind of a bit wider, and the diagram that they provide is pretty useful as well, because you can see, and here's pretty common, you have your code in GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, not code commit because that's dead now, but in various other
Not that
things.
you're bitter about that.
I'm really salty. Just think of the number of diagrams they've had to update as well. Poor people. But then you pull it through and you do your build, and then you push your app out to test flight, you push your web version onto Amplify, so on and so on. Wonderful. There's a better way though, and honestly, I know this is an AWS podcast, but I remember reading this and I remember thinking, we actually spent, the firm I was at the time, and I'm not going to name them, but we actually spent, because I sat down and I did the maths, and it was 4 days a month I was spending on maintaining hardware, and the hardware was cheaper than doing it the software way with EC2s. So it worked out to be cheaper to just spend the money for an annual subscription to a PaaS service that builds this for you, that does all this for you, manages it for you. And that was $4,000 a year. And it was cheaper because of, engineer salary costs, lost time, all the rest of it. It was just cheaper to pay the $4,000 and go, okay, job done. And I think they gave us 50% off for the first year anyway. So for the first year, it was $2,000. And it was, hang on, that's paid for itself with an ROI of 3 months or 4 months or whatever it was at the time on engineer costs, because it wasn't just me having to look after it. And then there was the power costs, because yes, okay, they run cheaply, but they were sat in places that you had to do power and cooling and all that jazz. So it ended up just being cheaper to offload this to a PaaS service or a SaaS service. I don't know what, build as a service. I don't call it BaaS because that sounds like someone from EastEnders. But it ended up just being cheaper to offload it and not manage it at all. So this suffers from that. This is still going to be more expensive, I think, in keeping things up to date. Maybe not, because in theory it should keep itself up to date, but you still have to provision all the hardware. So it's going to be quite expensive just to run. So I reckon it's probably going to be cheaper to just use this $4,000 a year service and suck it up.
What do you think, Luis? Is relevant in your world?
Yes, it's relevant because we mainly in our software factory we develop using Flutter. Flutter has some advantages and some disadvantages. For example, if we build for Android, is Flutter build APK ready. But if you want to build for macOS, from 3 months ago, we always have a problem with pods, and our developers even have to upgrade their macOS version. So we have a lot of problems there. It's kind of interesting that AWS has proposed this alternative, but if we are a developer, it's kind of nice because we only make one change and it will build, and we have no problem. But as a DevOps, we have to check, because there is like a double-edged sword, because it will give you all the infrastructure, all the good benefits that we have, that if we deploy an EC2 with other operative SO, but we have to deal with the 24 hours, restrictions, because we have to, this kind of artifact has to live 24 hours minimum. Then you can destroy it, stop it, or anything you want. But also you have to check this thing that they call dedicated fleet, because I think it will cost more. For example, I was very excited as young when AWS, I think it was during the pandemic, that showed that we can deploy macOS. So it was very cool, very nice. And in our company, we try to change our infrastructure, but we make some math, and it was cheaper. It was cheaper to buy for all the team Mac Mini than use AWS. So we have to maybe, if there is more support from the community, maybe the prices will go low, or maybe we can have a pay as you go, because it's kind of interesting, this alternative. but we have to check the billings.
That's the thing, isn't it? That's why the cloud generally democratized access to kit, because you didn't have to buy lots of big expensive servers, rack, stack, power, cooling, all the rest of it. You don't have to do that, but you still have all the downsides of running something 24/7 with macOS. And this is an Apple license problem, fundamentally. If that particular problem can be solved, or that nut can be cracked, I would be much more excited about this. But until that point, buy the hardware still, because, okay, they're horrendously expensive, but buy the hardware or use something like a PaaS service. And I will name check the PaaS service. It's called codemagic.io. So if you are reading this article and you're interested in it, go and look it up, because I'm a big fan.
We use CodeMagic. We use CodeMagic. It's really impressive.
Nice. Yeah. So maybe an acquisition for AWS.
It's cute that you think someone from AWS listens to us rambling.
You never know. You never know. Anyway, on that note, let's move along to our second article for this week. And this is an article from the AWS Cloud Operations and Migrations blog about how you can leverage Amazon Q to upgrade Lambda runtime functions. So we've got to our second article. We're on the subject of AI again. We're always talking about AI these days, as seems to be the trend. But I'll come to you first on this one, Luis. What are your thoughts on leveraging Amazon Q to upgrade Lambda runtime functions?
Amazon Q is a very interesting tool, or I don't know, I call it tool because it's a tool. You can use it. It's kind of interesting that they are using Q to improve this kind of migration of versions, because we have Python 3.7 or migrate to Python 3.12. It's kind of interesting because it will help us as developers. I talk from the perspective of a developer, because I came from a perspective from developer. I made code from almost 14 years. I code in PHP or Python, so I like to code. It is kind of interesting because it can teach you or point you how many functions can you change or you can evolve. It will save you time because you don't have to read the documentation. For example, I came from PHP 4 and now we have PHP 8. There was a lot of changes that if you don't constantly search, look for information, you wouldn't know. So Amazon Q will reduce this learning curve for us. And this tool, as you mentioned, AI is here. We have to embrace it. So, or maybe I don't know. I don't know if we are in the year that maybe John Connor is about to born. So we have to wait if he's here, no, to save us, because we are kind of all the Terminator movies. We only have to wait that Skynet awakes, and maybe we are training Amazon Q to convert in Skynet. We don't know, but we have to embrace it.
The day Amazon starts a line of tanks, I'm going to be very concerned. God, that's going to get us banned from YouTube, isn't it?
Well, you might have tanks. Water tanks. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's an interesting article for me because I went to, and I've spoken about this on the pod a few times, but I went to the London offering for the AWS Developer Advocate on tour that they did, which was for London, which was horrifically badly attended because the marketing wasn't really done very well. And I think it's because almost all of the team live in London. They just kind of didn't care. They had to do London first, and then the rest of it was more interesting to them. Whatever. One of the talks was about using Amazon Q. It was back in preview. No, it wasn't Q. Was it Q? It's become Q. It was Code Whisperer. But functionally we're talking similar sorts of things here for generating and performing low impact, high volume actions that just suck developer time. The example that they used at the time was generating test data. I think it was. And that was, look, here's all my open code. Can you generate some test data to give me some, reasonable test data for unit tests for these, please? Cool. And it comes up with half decent data. What I think is quite telling is this article, and you go a little way down, it calls it out, is the code generated by Amazon Q is an initial draft to assist developer productivity. It must be thoroughly tested and so on and so on. And I do wonder if and I've said this a few times as well, something like Code Whisperer or Q seems to be a replacement for a very junior engineer, and they just need a lot of hand-holding and help to get things over the line. I can't remember who said this, but I saw this on the internet on one of those, TikTok doom scrolling sessions that we all are guilty of, that basically said, if you take a job and it takes a developer 3 hours to write it, an hour to debug it, all done. You get an AI to do the writing, it takes them 5 seconds to write it, and the developer takes another 10 hours to debug it to get it working. So it's worse. Yes, the generation is really, really fast, but it's worse because you just spend so much more time dealing with it. So I wonder if we're still in that kind of situation. Because as it says, it's a tool, it's to help productivity. It gives you kind of, here's all the things you need to change between version 3.7 and 3.12. Okay, cool. I can get you to make those. I'll then go and test it, debug it, run it through my unit test and all the rest of it. So it's not using using Q to do it. It's using Q to help. And I'm not convinced that we're at the point where you would just use its code as a drop-in, add all your unit tests to pass. I'm not convinced. And really, what I'd really like to see is how well it performs going from not a minor update to another minor update. Granted, it's a number of them, but going from something like Python 2 to Python 3, which is a massive refactoring. Mm-hmm. So I wonder. I wonder. I'm not sold.
Are you sold, Luis? Will you use it, do you think? Or?
I'm kind of 50-50 because I also work as a teacher in a private university here in Peru. We have constant discussions about how we are going to use AI with second year students because we teach programming. We have to teach them if, else, and all the logics. If you copy and paste one exercise we develop in ChatGPT or any other AI tool, it will develop in almost 2 to 5 seconds. So we have to learn that AI is here, try to use it correctly to save us time, not to save us money, because we don't want to we want to fire people. We have to embrace it, to use it, and to improve. As John says, it will be kind of cool if you tell us how to migrate from version 2 to 3, or in my example, PHP 4 to PHP 8. It will help us a lot of time to search information on the internet or any place.
Cool. Well, the jury's out, but I guess as these things develop, more and more people will start to adopt them. On that note, let's move on to our third article for this week, which is from the AWS Compute blog. And this is about the introduction of recursive loop detection APIs in AWS Lambda. So, John, I know serverless is your chosen specialized subject. So tell us about the introduction of recursive loop detection APIs.
Don't use them.
Okay. Let's move on. No, why not?
Yeah, so start with a strong opinion because it gets listeners. Right, what is it? So loop detection is something that's quite important in Lambda because Lambda can be called from a whole raft of different things. And the example that the article uses is you can trigger Lambda from an SNS topic because you can subscribe it to a topic, and you could do it from a queue as well if you wanted to. And that Lambda could then put something back onto the same topic or the same queue. And it ends up just triggering itself over and over and over and over and over and over and over if you don't handle that properly. Loop detection handles that for you. Built in, automatic, don't have to worry about it. What does it do? Well, it puts what it calls a primitive header, and you don't have to track this. You don't have to do it. It just does it onto the request. And it says, how many times have I been triggered from this source? And if it gets to 16, it cuts out and just says, nope, not doing that anymore. And depending on how you've called it, it gives you an exception or an error code or a whatever, depending on how you've called it. That's massively useful because a lot of the time, recursion in Lambdas is a mistake. A lot of the time, it's a mistake. However, what AWS is saying is in some cases, it's not. And I would argue that 99% of the time, it is a mistake and they shouldn't have done this and they should have just told people to suck it up. But there we go. What is this handling? This is handling a Lambda lith. If you've not come across the term before, monolith in a software engineering world is one big app that kind of does everything. It takes lots of different inputs, generates lots of different outputs. Your app is a thing. And over the past last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a push away from monoliths and into microservices. Lambdas historically have been viewed as a very small microservice. The idea being that each Lambda function does one thing only. It takes one known input, does one thing to it, generates one known output, or a couple of known outputs, depending on the value of the input. A Lambda lith is a monolith in a Lambda that can handle lots and lots of different types of input, different formats potentially, loads of different values and so on, and spit something else out down the other end. Now, in some cases, it might genuinely need to call itself because it's been called from this queue or this topic with one particular input. It's transformed that input and it needs to pass it back to itself to then do the next part of the processing. Okay, fine. That's a general valid use case, but I would argue that those two parts of the processing should be split into two different Lambdas and either call one from the next or orchestrate them with a step function, break them up with a queue, do something else, because generally monoliths are considered as kind of not great anymore. They're not inherently bad, they're not inherently good, but it feels like shoehorning Lambda into working a way that it was never meant to, and that's kind of bad. But what these APIs are doing is basically saying you can override the recursion detection if that is a valid thing for you. But if you think you need this, you have bigger architectural problems, in my opinion.
Do you have an opinion on this one, Luis?
Yes, I agree with John because you as a developer, you have to know if you want to use a recursive function. No, that is, first of all, AWS is like giving you a solution from your mistakes, because you have to know if you have to split your function in 3 parts, you have to do it. You don't have to assume that it will work because in localhost work. No? I think you have to you have other architectures to, if you want to do recursive, you have to microservice, Kubernetes, or maybe if you don't want to use any of that, you can go to the old classic monolith. So I think this is like give you like a hack to hide all your mistakes. It's like a hack. It's a hack. Because I know if I want to do a recursive loop function, it's like if you want to, we all know that if you want to implement a while true condition, you have to put a break. So you are responsible of breaking the while loop. Here in Lambda, you are assuming that AWS will do it for you. So you are making a bad, in my opinion, making a bad decision if you don't control that.
So why do you think AWS have introduced this then, if it's not best
one very
practice
large corporate has decided they need it?
Because
often the way these things go, yeah. Sorry, go on, Luis.
I think because many of developers nowadays don't learn the basics. They only follow a tutorial from YouTube or any channel, and they learn, for example, I will master Node.js in 15 minutes. Yeah, you can learn Node.js in 15 minutes or any framework, but you don't know the basics. You don't know how memory works, how you have to implement a while loop, for each loop, and all the things that you learn from the basics. That is for, it's not from my generation, but many people from other generation learned C, language C, that doesn't have any of the cool things that we have, that objects, garbage collector. They will do a recursive loop. Maybe no, maybe yes. It depends. So I think it is like a temporary solution. I think they will, in some months, they will maybe remove it or expand the limit. I think that we will do that.
Well, we'll see. I think learning the basics is going to become less and less common in this world of AI, where you can just get AI to do it for you. Anyway, on that note, let's move on to another article about AI. And this one is all about managing security events in Slack, Teams, or Amazon Chime using AWS Chatbot and our good friend Amazon Q again. So, John, what are your thoughts on managing security events in Slack with Chatbot and Q?
I don't hate this. I don't hate this as a usage for Q either, because it's one of those kind of handy things where Q is basically doing the chatbot for you. You haven't had to go into, it's not Polly, into AWS Chatbot. to kind of build what they call the utterances and the responses and build all of that yourself. You've not had to do that, which is quite nice. No, that's Lex that I'm thinking about. Chatbot is just the thing that integrates with Slack. But you haven't had to go into Lex and build the utterances and the responses and kind of all of that jazz. You just hooked up Chatbot to Q and it's doing the chatbot stuff for you, which is fine. I like that. I don't have a problem with that. I did notice and giggle at the fact that it says using Amazon Chime, because no one outside of Amazon uses Chime. So they've got to get that in there. That made me chuckle. But generally, this is a good idea. This is a cool idea. It's nice that they've kind of gone with, here's what security events look like. Bish, bash, bosh. Here's a nice diagram. Here's how it all hangs together. You can interact with the chatbot, and it says, okay, what do you actually want to do? And gives you sort of call and response. Great. They've gone with that because AWS chatbot. Is it Amazon or is it AWS? AWS chatbot has a schema that it works with, and a number of services support that schema out of the box, so it will just work. CloudWatch is one of them. That's quite good. Guard Duty is another. Inspector is another. Security Hub is another. But you can't just send custom stuff to it without having to kind of make sure you're sending it in the right format and all the rest of it. So they kind of picked a thing that works out of the box without you having to worry about your data structures. Fine. Generally, I like this. I like chat ops, as it's called, because I spend far too much time in Slack as it is anyway, mostly sending you memes. But if you could do everything in Slack without having to leave Slack to investigate this problem, create a support case, raise an alarm, escalate to somebody else, it just saves time and tool switching. So generally, I'm for this.
How about you, Luis? Do you like it?
Yes, I like it because I think nowadays many of developers or companies use Slack. It's like a powerful tool. As John says, who uses Amazon Chime? Only the people who work in AWS.
Well, Amazon didn't put Chime in the diagram. They put Slack in the diagram, I noticed.
But if you, for example, schedule a meeting with an AWS architect, they will send you a Chime link. So they use it. So they have, yeah. But this integration is very helpful because they are promoting to you. They're promoting for us to develop a small agents or chatbots that can help us to reduce sometimes in looking for information about security, because nowadays security is very like the main topic. If you don't secure your architecture, your information, you are exposed, and maybe they can ransomware you or store information from you. So it's like a cool thing that you can have a personal assistant that can help you to fix this. You can just do this and all the things that you can do and save you time, no? And I think it's a very powerful tool. Let's see if they expand it to using other services. For example, in +1 we use Discord because many of the developers are gamers. So a powerful tool for them is Discord.
Cool. Watch this space.
I did once hear Slack described as Discord for old people at work.
Well, that's probably why I like it then, because I don't think I've ever used Discord. I'm not a gamer. Yeah, my gaming career kind of stopped in the ZX Spectrum 48K days with Daley Thomas's Decathlon.
So you played Pong, did you?
No, that was a little bit before my time, but not much. So anyway, on that note, let's move along to our final article for this week. And this one is about potential misconfigurations exposing a large number, as many as 15,000 AWS environments to attack due to a misconfiguration of the ALB, application load balancer. So we got a lot of clients using ALBs. I think John has reassured me that this probably is not relevant for any of our clients, but 15,000 is a large number of people who are potentially affected by this. So what are your thoughts on this, Luis? Have you seen any environments affected by this?
No, I didn't see any environments, but I have a kind of dilemma, because this is, for me, this is like this problem doesn't fit. No, sorry, this problem doesn't fit in the shared responsibility model. If there is a misconfiguration in the application load balancer, I'm the client, you are AWS. I'm the one that make the bad configuration. So in the shared responsibility model, I'm the one who have to fix that, not AWS, or I didn't get it right, because since I start cloud until here, I know the shared responsibility model. There are two big parts: AWS customers, security in your data, your infrastructure, ports, and anything else. AWS provides me the infrastructure. They assure me an SLA of 99 any percent. So I kind of dilemma, because I don't understand why AWS in this article tell us that, and there is a shared responsibility model. So I don't know. All the things that I have learned these 4 years disappear, and this problem is AWS. So I kind
This
of
is a PR problem for AWS more than a technical one, because you're not wrong. Shared responsibility puts this squarely on the customer that made the mistake.
Mhm.
So there's a couple of issues I take with this article. The first is, I mean, I love the name AL Beast. I love that. That's a brilliant name. That's great. I take a few issues with this. The first is as many as 15,000. In my slightly more than half a dozen years of working in cloud and over a decade in tech more generally, have not once come across a single deployment using this. Not once. Also, 15,000. That sounds like a big number, but in the scope of AWS, it's not. It's less than a percent. It's less than a fraction of a percentage of people that will actually be using this. Because, well, what is this particular thing? It's generating a token, JWT, I think, Cognito is what they talk about here, to then authenticate the user so they can go through and have kind of semi-seamless applications. Cool, wonderful. I've not done that on an ALB. I have done that on API Gateway, which implements that just generally quite a lot nicer, because you guess here's the audience, here's the sub, here's the claim, bosh, and it all kind of works. Wonderful. And what you're doing there is you're using a federated login provider, Google, Microsoft, Apple, whatever, and they say, yes, this user is valid, send back the token, inspect the token. Brilliant, wonderful, we've got all of our data. It's not something I've seen hugely in ALBs, or in fact at all, ever. And it's not something I would really do, because there are better ways of doing authentication if you're running through an ALB. 99% of ALB deployments that I've ever come across, actually 100% of ALB deployments that I've ever come across, have been for serving a web application through the load balancer, so you can have multiple backend servers, or you don't have to expose the server to the internet directly, or that kind of thing. It's been more natting and obfuscation than it is doing the security directly on the load balancer. So this is not something that I think is a massive problem. I think it's been a little bit blown up by the article and the security firm generally, because, over 15,000, it looks better on paper. Big numbers are scarier, I think, is the problem here. And to Luis's point, shared responsibility, this is firmly on the customer. And what they say in the article, again, it's a little bit unkind to AWS. I'm not kind to AWS by and large, but this is a little bit unkind, because it says they were told back in April or whatever, and they've updated the documentation and added new code. Wonderful. That's all they needed to do. I don't whatever. We're now in August, and all they've done is updated their docs. That's all they needed to do. This is on the users that have done this. Sorry, it just is.
Sensationalization in the press. Whatever next?
I know, who'd have thought?
Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, on that note, we have reached the end of our time for season 3, episode 31 of Logicast. So I'd just like to welcome you back into the saddle, John, and thank you for your insights as always. And Luis,
regular viewers will note I'm in a different location.
Oh, yes, they will. Either that, or you've got a virtual background generated by AI. Which is it? Ooh, who knows? But I'd also like to thank Luis for joining us today, all the way from Peru. So thank you very much for your insights, Luis. It's been great to have you on. If you enjoyed the podcast, tell your friends. You can download us from wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to see John's new background, we also are available to watch on YouTube. We'll be back next week with another episode of Logicast for you. In the meantime, thanks for listening. See you.